Welcome to the Lindamood-Bell radio podcast, where we explore topics in learning and literacy. I'm Dave Hungerford, and in this episode, I had the chance to talk with my colleague Paul Worthington about the state of reading education and some projects he has been involved with. And I'm joined today by Paul Worthington, the Director of Research and Development, who's been with Lindamood-Bell for 30 years?
30
years, and has served as Director of our School Services Division, Director of Research and Development. I think you were a clinician and tutor at one point, Center Director. You've pretty much done it all throughout the organization. But I want to thank you for joining me today and want to talk to you a little bit about the state of reading education and some of the research that's going on currently.
My pleasure.
So tell me about the early days when you first started working with school districts and trying to help them better educate their teachers on how to teach their students how to read. What was that like?
Well, the beginning part of it had to do with an ongoing question related to Lindamood-Bell's work, because we had been working for a number of years with children on a one-to-one basis, and we did professional development in the programs that Pat Lindamood and Nancy Bell had developed. And one of the critiques was, or from individuals in school environments, teachers who would take our training programs, and et cetera, would say, well, in the real world, we've got 30 kids in the classroom. We can't do the clinical work that you do. And so we wound up putting the offer out on the streets to schools. And interestingly enough, the first taker on it was not a school system, but the Motorola Corporation decided that it would be fine for us to come in and work in a group environment with their employees who had literacy issues. And that really set the stage for an invite from a school district up in Alaska to say, which said to us, because of the realities they were faced with, there's got to be a way to do this in public education. So that frontier kind of spirit allowed us to embark on taking what it is that we did clinically in a private environment, in a one-on-one situation, and then apply it to a very large cross-section of individuals, both developmentally in classrooms, as well as doing remedial work in small group and instruction. And by the way, the only reason that we do one-on-one instruction is that we don't have the luxury of drawing on a whole body of children who have very similar profiles. Families bring their kids in on a one-to-one basis, but in a school environment, if you've got an elementary school that has 500 kids in it, and let's just pick, let's say 200 of those kids are in third grade, it's not hard to find 5 or 10 kids who have comparatively a very similar profile. And that's how we got started.
Why is it that it's been so hard for education to have a high literacy rate for students? It's been a struggle for 30, 40 years that we've known about.
That's absolutely correct.
Why is it so hard?
Yeah, and it's still an issue. There are a number of variables that I'm convinced now largely because of a large corpus of interdisciplinary research that contribute to both the historical and the contemporary situation in educational attainment, specifically within the area of literacy. Let me itemize what I think are the big ticket items. And by the way, and this is very consistent with the philosophy by which we operate in order to address the needs for children, both on an individual as well as a collective basis. It goes something like this. If you consider sort of a research model and you say, if the dependent variable is student achievement based initially on their ability to read, very broadly interpreted, there are a series of variables that we have to control for. And the research is substantially clear on this. The first variable is that for children at risk, we have to do differential diagnosis. In other words, it's pretty much a medical model. You got to figure out what's going on with a child. The science is now sophisticated enough in the private and in some public sectors that people now know how to do that much better than they have, but it hasn't caught up in public education. Let me state it from a policy standpoint. There's no reason that if a child is not able to read effectively as compared to their age, cohort, and or grade level, there's no excuse, because the science is now sophisticated enough is that we should be able to figure that out. That's not sifted down into public education yet. It's getting better, but it's nowhere near what it needs to be. So differential diagnosis is the first variable. Secondly, again, using pretty much a medical model, once there's a clear understanding of what the child's profile is, the second issue is then to customize the intervention. Schools are not set up for customized intervention. You could have a classroom of 30 kids, and you're going to get a huge array of variables, children with all kinds of different profiles. You could have kids who have purely behavioral issues, but kids on the spectrum, kids with dyslexia, kids who have vocabulary and or comprehension problems, and add to that the complexity of kids who might speak English as a second language, and then further yet, kids who come out of a high poverty environment and they simply haven't been exposed to literature. So that's the aggregate. Now, the science is clear on how to differentiate all those profiles, and that's one thing. But the other thing is, how do you do that within an environment that's not organized in such a way in order to accommodate the diverse needs of the population of kids within school? So that's variable number 2. Number 3, even more complicated. Number 3 is, let's just call it environmental modifications. Assuming you have the right diagnostic protocol on a kid or children in the case of public ed, and assuming through that diagnosis you know what to do about it, there's a large array of environmental modifications that have to be controlled for that schools have not been able to set up effectively. I'm speaking in generalities. There, of course, are always exceptions, but largely this is the algorithm that needs to be addressed. And what I mean by environmental modifications, if you have a child, let's pick just elementary school to make this simple. If you have a child that's in 5th grade and they're reading at a first grade level, even if you know what diagnostically is wrong with them, and even if you know what to do about it, do you have control of the primary variable from an environmental standpoint? Does that teacher then know how to take that diagnostic information and then remediate that kid? Do they have the luxury of doing that with every other child that happens to be within their classroom in the case of just a general 5th grade class? If they can, in other words, and here's one of the major environmental modifications, and essentially, this was argued clear back in year 2000 when the National Reading Panel report came out. It's that not only do we need to control for vocabulary, comprehension, phonemic awareness, fluency, etc., we have to, for kids who are more than a grade level or a standard deviation behind the mean for their age and or grade level, they're going to have more of it, and they're going to have it intensively. In other words, more time. Where does teacher get a time to do that? In fact, that brings up the most important environmental variable that affects student achievement. Once a child lands in school, the biggest factor that affects student achievement are the aggregate competencies of the teachers who have contact with those kids. If a teacher does not, essentially translated, if a teacher does not have competency in teaching reading, in the simple view, it doesn't matter. Even if you have number 1 and number 2 controlled for diagnostic information and a remedial understanding of what needs to be done, if the teacher doesn't know how to do it, and if the teacher can't do it intensively, you're not going to see progress. That's the 30,000-foot view of the larger issue that we're faced with in public ed right now. So how do we translate that and then provide for all those variables that need to be controlled for in order to, in the main, take a school and or a district and turn them around?
And is that realistic? Can a school change that given the funding process they have and what's in place?
It used to be that there was a lot of pessimism about that, but now we have prototypes wherein administrators, school boards, teachers have rallied behind an understanding of those issues that they're faced with and made the commitment to control for those variables that I just outlined. And if they do, then they're in a situation where they can start to expect significant and sustained progress over time. And we've got some prototypes.
Give me an example. Who have you worked with in the past that's been a great, successful district?
The best early started in 1996. It was an interesting scenario because the state of Colorado passed what was called the Colorado Literacy Act in 1996. And in other words, there was a mandate that all children by the age of 7 or 8, third grade, basically, had to be literate. It was now enacted in the state's legislation. And so when the first tests come out the year after the Literacy Act was passed, Pueblo School District, 60 at the time, some of their schools only had 12% of their third grade kids literate. The school board challenged
12%?
12%. At that for that first year. Now, this is a high poverty, high minority district. It had all the social liabilities that everybody always talks about.
And this is the state reading test.
This is the state mandated
high bar. I mean, it was super high bar.
No, because there was if you go 50 miles up the road to the Academy School District near the Air Force Academy, the kids in that district were scoring 70, 80 percentile. 70 or 80% of the kids were literate at the third grade level. So the school board mandated the district, you better go out and find something because this is not acceptable. It's the law. We got to change the game. Long story short, we were invited as a number of institutions that were under consideration. They decided, once presented with the formula that we recommend based on the research, that they need to control for these variables. They took the proverbial bull by the horns. They let us train the teachers to make them competent. They allowed us to do intensive intervention. They allowed us to do the diagnostic work. And we basically hooked up with them for 10 years. And over that period of time, in the first year, the first school that they gave us was a school called Bessemer Elementary School. Bessemer only was the school in that particular district that had 12% population, or 12% of the third grade population were literate. The first year, they went from 12% to 63%. The second year, they went to 74%. The third year, they went to 83% proficiency in reading for the third grade kids.
I was going to ask how to be there that long and to get that many people on board must have been quite a challenge.
It was an extreme challenge. It was an extreme challenge at every conceivable on every conceivable front. Politically, there were a number of people opposed to it. At the beginning, the union was opposed to it. They finally came on board when they saw it was hard to argue with the success that we were having with the district. The school board entirely embraced us.
How big is Pueblo? What sort of city is that?
17,000 children, 30 plus elementary schools, 4 middle schools, 4 high schools. And by the way, 60 to 70% poverty, Title I district, and roughly the same in 1976 in terms of their minority population. So that continued, and the state of Colorado, the folks from Pueblo were recognized all the way up to the White House. They were brought in as sort of a beacon of success on what's possible. Now, having said that, to replicate that has been equally difficult. Schools still are not in a situation where, for a variety of reasons, many legitimate, funding one, leadership another, any number of variables will be served up as impediments, either legitimate or illegitimate, in order to control for the kinds of things you need to control for making a difference in schools.
And you said that you trained the teachers. What changed in the classroom? Was it they set aside a certain amount of time per day? Did they rearrange classrooms? Did they?
Yeah, it was interesting
instruction?
because when the federal government reauthorized the Individuals with Disability in the Education Act in 2004, the evolution that came out of that, what's now known as the response to intervention model. And that was a new term for us, but it exactly mirrored the kinds of things that we had started way back when. And in other words, there are various tiers, and you start developmentally, and the research is clear in this, the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, research that we've done at MIT, research that we've done at Georgetown, and what we're now doing at the University of Washington with Jason Yateman and his colleagues are clearly pointing to the same thing that we recognize, that you have to start as early as possible from a developmental standpoint. RTI refers that to Tier 1 intervention. In other words, there hasn't been enough time for the kids to spread apart simply because they're younger, so that you can offer these sensory cognitive programs that are necessary for literacy development in all the 5 components mandated by the National Reading Panel report, and you can do it collectively in a classroom of 20, 25, 30 kids.
Because everybody's learning to read.
Everybody's learning to read. So you start there, and then again, picking up on what's now known as RTI, you can, before long, the children who, for whatever reason, are falling out a little bit, you can do a push-in kind of instruction under, again, that model. So if it looks like they're struggling a little bit, then instantly you go in and you can do your differential diagnosis, separate those kids out who, for example, might have phonological processing or symbol imagery issues, separate out the kids who have vocabulary or maybe comprehension issues, their decoding's coming online, and provide them a small group customized intervention at an accelerated rate. In other words, giving them more time, and you start to minimize your losses. And then after that, for the more severe kids, for whatever reason, if it looks like they're still not maintaining their growth commensurate with their growth at age and or grade level, then you tease them out and you set up a clinic which is much more intensive, and try to get them caught up, because the psychometric realities are this. If you wait until 5th grade and they don't get what they need in 1st grade, they're going to stay at 1st grade, and now they're 4 years behind. Why do it at 5th grade when you can find out at 1st grade and they're only a few months behind? That's the thumbnail sketch of.
And 4 years of failure is going to lead to other issues.
Yeah, and those are the statistics that we already have. Across the United States, the numbers in special ed have not changed for the last 3 decades. Essentially, give or take a few percentile points across the country. Connecticut has, for example, they identify a lot more kids who are in special ed, and they've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 12%. You go to some other states, and it's down around 8%. But averaged out, we still got about 10% of the kids in special ed across the country. The lion's share of those kids have language and learning disabilities, and the lion's share of those kids have identifiable, diagnosable learning disabilities that can be treated.
So in this kind of model you've laid out, where does dyslexia fit into that stream?
Squarely in the middle of it.
I know a lot of states are coming out with or have already put into place dyslexia initiatives they want to resolve this term. How are they defining it nationally or state?
Well, actually,
and how are they resolving it?
It's a great question, because the states are essentially following suit with the feds. The feds came out with federal legislation that say you got to deal with this. We know, again, statistics vary, but as much as 10% of the kids who have language and learning disabilities, and most professionals say it's a lot harder simply because they've not been diagnosed. Folks in public education really do not have the requisite knowledge, again, not necessarily through no fault of their own, but given the way our system has been running, they've not caught up with the science behind how it is to not only diagnose but treat kids who have dyslexia. It's around 11%. Some numbers are higher, some are lower, but it's significant. If you just take a school of 500 kids, do the math. You're looking at 50 kids who have dyslexia alone, not to mention a variety of other issues that could be comorbid or developmentally are going along with that.
Is there any sort of consistency on what it means to be dyslexic?
Yes, there is. There's substantial, diagnostically speaking, yes. It is a clear and distinct marker from a neurological standpoint, and it could be just developmental, but based developmentally on beginning in the genetic format, where children cannot perceive the number, order, and sequence of sounds and letters in their relationship to one another in syllables. And that's really how simple it is. It's not a hearing acuity issue. It's simply an issue of being able to parse out the relationship and not be confused about how sounds and letters correspond to one another in syllables. And the simple view is if a child looks at a word that's spelled S-T-O-P and they say spot, where they reverse the P and the T, and if they cannot tell visually or from their auditory system that they didn't hear that they reversed the P and the T, or they didn't notice visually that there was some dissonance in their brain when they reversed the letters in the correspondence to the sounds, it's a classic symptom that's associated with it.
So you're talking about some decoding skills, and I know that there used to be technically in schools for students to be diagnosed as dyslexic, typically there had to be a difference between like higher comprehension and lower those decoding skills. There had to be that gap. Is that still the case, or has that changed?
No, that's changed, and it's largely changed. The science is now clear. There's no distinction across the board from an intelligence standpoint. There's only a slight variation that shows that kids who have a dyslexic profile in a lower IQ range is not really any different from the numbers of kids who, as you move on up the full scale IQ, dyslexia does not discriminate. In other words, we know that from our own. Every year in Lindamood-Bell, we see 3,000 to 4,000 kids, and the lion's share of the kids that come in here have decoding problems. And while we work with a lot of kids in schools who are in high poverty environments, the kids that come in for private intervention, just to be honest, their families have the means to do it. And these kids are typically comparatively from more affluent families.
Where you would presume they're reading at home, they're surrounded by books.
Exactly. They don't have any environmental excuse. For example, high poverty, they don't speak English as a second language typically. None of those other markers. And sure enough, we get just as many who are either diagnosed or undiagnosed as having dyslexia. And by the way, we just did some research on this. Fully a third of the kids that come in who do have a classic dyslexic profile have already been diagnosed as dyslexic. We just did internal study, starting in 2008. We got over 4,000 kids, roughly a third of those, 3,000 kids, roughly a third of those had already been diagnosed as dyslexic, but we found another 2/3 who had the same kind of dyslexic profile, had never been diagnosed, and they came out of public ed.
So the diagnostic process is not consistent.
It hasn't caught up yet.
Well, are you hopeful for change?
I am. There are some good markers. We continue to beat the bushes in sharing the knowledge that we have of translating the science behind being able to both diagnose and treat learning disabilities such as dyslexia. And one of the markers is that there's a larger and larger percentage of people out of public ed who are requesting professional development in this area. So that's one. Number two, the neuroscience behind what it is that we've experientially discovered that Pat and Nancy have uncovered through many, many years of trial and error, just working with and then developing approaches to address the needs of these kids. Now science is substantiating from a neurobiological standpoint what it is that's going on or not going on, as the case might be, in the human brain. And then, but most importantly, we now have neurological evidence that when we have the opportunity to control for all those variables, diagnosis, remediation, intensive intervention, etc., not only do we see the behavioral changes and have the opportunity to truly experience remediation for these children, but we now have neurobiological evidence that we're both increasing gray matter in the human brain. That's largely based on the study that Guinevere Eden did. And we're changing the connectivity of the human brain based on the work that's going on at MIT and what we are currently discovering at the University of Washington. If we can translate that and get that out there to substantiate the argument that we're making that it need not only happen in the private sector, but that it can also happen in the public sector, so people embrace this concept and accept the science behind what it is that we're arguing for from an educational standpoint, then I think we'll see concomitant change.
So there is some hope.
There is some hope.
Well, I want to thank you for coming in today. I'd like to, in the near future, talk to you about some of the research projects that you're involved with.
Yeah, let's segue that. I'd be happy to join in and then address some of the findings from the current literature that's been published based on the work that we've been collaborating with universities on.
That'd be great. And thank you for listening to the Lindamood-Bell radio podcast. I hope you listen to more episodes, and if you enjoyed this, please subscribe. Follow Lindamood-Bell on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Lindamood-Bell.